Let's just, yeah, you're all set up.
Welcome.
Paloma, thank you.
Thank you for being here with us.
Oh, great. Folks, good morning. It's a pleasure to be back here. I was here last year, and I had a blast, and it's such an honor to provide the first lecture with such a challenging topic such as the future of education. And I wanna emphasize some of the criteria and some of the points that make up the future education. There's not a single answer. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we do believe that technology changes the game. We do believe that changes in governance change the game, but also acknowledging the inherent complexity of building whatever solution that might work in the educational space. And that's what I'm willing to talk about during these 20 minutes here this morning. So we need something else. It's not to really bash the system, because each one of us is a product of traditional education system, so we know what we have been through, but at this point we need something else. And why? What's the problem? What's the challenge? What do you need to bear in mind? And educational systems were built for legibility, for someone that's sitting in an office, far from the classroom, far from the professional experience, to read whatever you're doing. And to read it, to understand through simplified information, through ever doubt information, whatever is happening there and what the policy should be based on those results. And this is not ideal. It helped a lot of people to get whatever outcome they needed in life, but this is not ideal. Most of the educational systems are top-down. They're designed by someone else. They're far away from the school. They're far away from the university. They're far away from the workplace. And they're dictated by a group of people that say, based on my experience, on my studies, that's how it should be done. It's top-down. The second is legible. And that's what I meant by legibility. Everything is reduced to discrete criteria such as grades, as cohorts, as averages. The specific attributes of the individual, they disappeared because everything gets averaged out. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to really read what the system is about. And the third is, as I told you, they are optimized for the average student who doesn't exist. There is no average student. And there is no consideration for whatever path, for context, for background information, and for whatever possibilities are available for that student. So these are the three fundamental limitations. We built education systems for scale. We built for remote governance. We built for cost effectiveness. And the world has changed. And that's pretty much the challenge that we're trying to solve through building. And this realization came up to me some time ago when I was a consultant and I was dealing with those large companies that you consult because they have the money to pay for your hours, they have the data, they have the structure. But there is a single book written by James Scott, which is named Seeing Like a State. And in this book, he criticizes policies that are well-intended, but they're based on the information loss for systems that are legible. So you design something to improve education, and in fact, it makes it worse. You design something to help students to progress throughout their academic journey, but in fact, what you end up with is dropouts. So the key point in his book, and I do recommend that you guys should read it, formal institutions, they depend on the richness and the depth done by the bottom up, by the actions of the individuals. That's how cities thrive, that's how societies thrive, and institutions come to organize that particular richness, that particular depth, but they never should curb whatever happens at the bottom. This is one of the most important realizations, and I saw that at that point in time in my career, it made a lot of sense, not only for governance by itself, but also by health systems, educational systems, and any other large-scale system that you're supposed to act upon. And for me, there's a key concept in this presentation, and it's possible futures. Why possible futures? Because there's not a single answer. It's not completely predictable. That's why possible futures. There should be many versions of the truth, many versions of what the education should provide. So there are some misconceptions that I want to share with you guys that make up how we design the educational systems, but the reality is completely different. The first one, the future education is determined. Multiple futures are available. There's not a single answer. Someone that has graduated for electrical engineer might end up as a banker, that might end up as an NGO worker. So there are multiple paths. There's no single direction. There's no single path. Technology will inevitably fix education. Obviously, we are technology optimists. That's why everybody here is in this room. However, the impact of technology is that it spans the space of what it's possible. So you deliver content at much lower cost, at much wider reach. That is actually made because of technology, but is not the final answer. The problem is more complex than just the technology vector. So technology should be part of a larger system in which it plays a critical role. And the third one, there's one right model to scale. And that's a kind of a paradigm we have from the technology industry that we can say, okay, let's scale once you find a single answer. There's no model to scale. You need to be responsible to the context of each one of the individuals, to each one of the schools, to each one of the universities. The model is local, and it reaches the scale of that particular locality. That's one of the things we observe also in educational systems in a very consistent basis. I'll skip through some of the evidence, but there's a single one that kind of signals the failure of traditional educational systems, not at the moment, but some of the unintended consequences related to our education model. This is one case I found in my professional career. I was leading a hiring marketplace something like 10 years ago. And in order to monetize the product and the performance of the marketplace, we needed to make sure that marketplace actually matched candidates and hires. And we had this curious case of the civil engineer. We had a bunch of job ads. There was no problem in getting job ads. And we had thousands of candidates applying for those positions, but not a single candidate was hired. And it was a super puzzling paradox. And once we look at each one of those job placements, and once we listen to the hires, there are two conclusions that we made at this point. One, there was a flood of civil engineers in the market. There are many more than the market actually could accommodate at that point. And once we started understanding the dynamics, there's a case in which, at first, we had a demand spike. In Brazil, I don't know if you guys remember, but in Brazil in 2010, 2011, there's a lot of optimism about infrastructure, about the World Cup, about the Olympics. There was a lot of demand for construction. And as a consequence, many people chose civil engineering as part of their careers. 3 years later, the economic boom failed. There's no economic boom anymore, no infrastructure projects anymore. Commercial real estate also going down as well. So the number of available positions shrunk considerably. But we had a ton of civil engineers coming into the marketplace. You can imagine how competitive the market was. That's why many of those candidates could not get a job after 2 years of graduation. And once we looked further, we understood that there was a double negative effect. There's not only the competition because of the number of people, but also because in a moment of crunch, construction companies, instead of hiring 20 engineers, they're hiring 2. But together with that, they're hiring, the 2 engineers had to have a much wider skill profile than the ones they hired 2 years before. So not only they're hiring less, but they're hiring people that were supposed to be more qualified once they left the university. You can imagine that at that point, all the civil engineers that are graduated in Brazil were somewhat obsolete given the education they had recently received. For me, that's the failure of the traditional education system, because there's no institution, and I worked for a higher ed institution 5 years later than that experience, that I was aware about how quickly the market changed, how different the skills demanded were, how in the woods were the students once they got into the marketplace. And that happens all the time. And there is not a single institution that is prepared for that. And that's something that you see in highest frequencies nowadays. With the advent of technology, with the changes in organizational structure, with the impact of artificial intelligence. For you, everybody's saying now what's going to be the future of software developers once you have LLMs doing a part of the work. We had a similar situation 10, 15 years ago, and for our regret, there's no single university that identifies that and changes according to that particular trend. That's the failure of educational traditional systems, and that's why we need something else. Here's a kind of some of the implications of that previous case. I'll browse through, but labor markets have been changing a lot faster than institutions do. So, as I shared with you at the beginning, we use 20th century frameworks and mindsets to address 21st century problems. And the context has changed considerably. And that's why we need something else also in the way you deal with governance. That's how we design institutions and how open they should be. We came from a past in which production was the constraint. You need economies of scale. Now, production capacity is abundant. The second, we had a context in which data was scarce. You needed those huge data banks. You needed to work on data architecture. It was super expensive. It was super allocated to companies that had the resources in order to build that structure. Today, data is ubiquitous. The cost of storage has been going down considerably, and this is the type of solution available to any organization on any particular scale. Standardization was the competitive advantage. We needed to be competitive through standardization. It was the only way in which you could produce something in mass with controlling the cost. Now, we want personalization at every level. Have you guys seen that MTV was shut down? MTV was the archetype of company in that particular space, in that particular moment. And now we have the algorithm of curation of YouTube. We have TikTok providing each experience in a different way. That's personalization at scale, a much different solution to a very permanent need human societies have. Finally, feedback was slow. Quarterly reviews, annual results. Now, feedback is instantaneous. You know right away whether a product worked or not. You know right away whether the customer is satisfied or not. You know right away whether you got the results or not. This is a completely different scenario than the one. But we think about, in the same way we thought about 10 years or 15 years ago. And that's also the mindset change that we need to put in place in order to build effective educational systems. And there are three patterns that you see that emerge with a very consistent, in a very consistent way once you look at those examples and you look at those failures. Those patterns, they reflect a little bit of the change of the complexity that you need to be mindful of when designing educational systems. First, the field. There's no optimal route. I remember that at that higher educational company I worked for, you could have the student that progressed on his education with good grades and good engagement. And that's the typical and traditional student. They are the student that struggled for the first part of the course, catched up, and then was able to fulfill the course criteria. And there's the student that came in a very difficult situation, was not able to catch up during the first year, but stayed and actually got the better grades in the second year. All the three are possible, all the three are viable, all the three are present, but you consider just the one a success case. The other two, they have a much more difficult time. Any educational system, needs to understand that there are multiple paths and those paths change constantly. It's not because you got the first result okay that the second is going to be okay. You are going to face a lot of different problems, and these problems condition not only the intervention you do at that point, but also the next steps available for institutions. So there's the second point as well about the pathway in the loop. Second order effects dominate. This is the dynamic of the civil engineer. The guy graduated, he was supposed to work in his field, but there are no jobs available. What's the second order effect? Who can predict for that? That's why there's a strong element in building and not predicting what the possible future should be. And for the first time in a long time, technology makes it possible for you to have these three patterns in mind, to address each one of those, because not only you can do it in a cost-effective way, but also you're able to represent the status and the state of each one of the students, of each one of the participants with a high degree of fidelity. Something that the traditional systems that average out everything wasn't able to do. The third point is that the real-time detection, you know exactly at that time what happened. You can address the gaps at that particular time and not 3 months, later, and not a year later. There's a considerable change versus the way we do things with all the grades, with all the cohorts in quarterly sequences. And finally, there's another interesting caveat to be explored is the jump to universality. If the solution that you develop for one domain is applicable to other, if you can teach calculus for a certain type of student, you can teach basic math to another type. This is possible once you have the canonical structure in place, once you have validated, once you're able to address those patterns. So we have, and we live in an age of possibility, uniquely offered by the new developments in technology, and all these possibilities that should be part in everything we do to address those particular patterns I shared with you guys. Here's a case about Merck, a company that's operating this way. I suggest you guys take a look. They are able to shortcut the traditional hiring process from identification of the candidate to the placement in a company from 10 months to 15 days. That's by addressing the specific gaps I told you guys about. And finally, what I believe is the opportunity is not look from the state perspective, but looking from the individual, because technology allows us to do that, navigate the fields and the different choices candidates and students have, adapting at each step, and responding to whatever gaps and hurdles students might face on a continued basis. It's not a fixed solution, it's an ever-changing solution, always focused on the individual. Well, let's talk for building something in education, in health, and any other sector that depends on those long journeys from users. Or exploring AI alternative systems, or if you want to partner in whatever new initiative in terms of addressing those gaps in traditional educational systems. Guys, it was a pleasure talking to you. I apologize for any mistakes. Thank you very much.